The security footage was playing on his laptop when his assistant walked in. She expected to find him reviewing contracts or reading financial reports the way he always was at 7 in the morning. Instead, he was sitting completely still, watching a small screen, and there was something on his face that she had not seen in 3 years of working for him. He was smiling. James Calloway had not always been the kind of man who sat in silence. His wife, Eleanor, had died 4 years ago, and she had been the one who kept sound in the house. Laughter at dinner, music on Sunday mornings. The particular noise of someone who was genuinely happy to be alive moving through the rooms of a home. When Eleanor died, the house on Prestige Hill became very quiet. James did not fill the silence. He worked instead. He had always worked hard, but now he worked in a way that had no edges, no stopping point, no reason except that stopping meant stillness and stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant Eleanor. He arrived at his office before anyone else and left after everyone had gone. He ate meals at his desk. He took calls during what should have been vacations. His assistant Rachel, who had worked for him since before Eleanor passed, watched all of this and said nothing because James Calloway was not the kind of man you said things to that he had not asked to hear. The house ran itself largely because of a small and efficient staff that James barely interacted with. A groundskeeper named Phil who tended the gardens. A cook named Mrs. Osei who left meals covered on the kitchen counter at the times James had specified and was gone before he got home most nights. And a housekeeper named Rosa Menendez who came 5 days a week and kept the 14-room house in the kind of order that James required without him ever having to think about it. James knew Rosa's name and knew she had worked in the house for 2 years and knew that she did her job well because nothing was ever out of place. Beyond that, he knew very little about her because he had never been home during the hours she worked and had never had a reason to be. Rosa Menendez was 44 years old and had 3 children. Her oldest, Marco, was 19 and studying engineering. Her middle child, Lucia, was 15 and obsessed with drawing. Her youngest was a 7-year-old boy named Tito who had been born with a hearing condition that had required 2 surgeries and would require a third before his 10th birthday. Rosa worked 6 days a week across 2 different houses and sent money home every month to her mother in another city who watched Tito during the long hours. She did not talk about any of this at work. She came in, she cleaned, she left. She was professional and invisible in the way that people in service work learn to be, because invisibility is often easier than the alternative. What Rosa did not know was that James had installed a security system upgrade 4 months ago that included interior cameras in the main living areas. Not to watch the staff. To satisfy an insurance requirement for the art collection he kept in the ground floor gallery. The cameras ran continuously, and James never watched the footage unless something required it. He had forgotten, mostly, that they were there. The camera footage he was watching on a Tuesday morning came to his attention by accident. His security company had flagged a motion alert from the previous afternoon because a door had been left open longer than the system expected. Rachel had pulled the footage to check it. She had watched about 30 seconds of it, and then she had walked directly into James's office and set the laptop on his desk without saying a word. James had looked up from his papers and looked at the screen and had not looked away since. On the screen, in the large formal living room that James used approximately 3 times a year for business gatherings, Rosa was cleaning. This part was ordinary. What was not ordinary was what happened when Rosa reached the far corner of the room near the antique side table where James kept a small framed photograph. She stopped. She looked at the photograph the way a person looks at something when they think they are completely alone. The photograph was of Eleanor. It was James's favorite. Eleanor at a lake somewhere, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware of being photographed, completely herself. Rosa looked at the photograph for a moment, and then she did something that James had watched 3 times now and still could not fully process. She said something to the photograph. Her lips moved. James could not hear it because the interior cameras had no audio. But she said something, and then she smiled at the photograph the way you smile at a person, not at an object, and she gave a small nod as though she had just agreed on something. And then she went back to cleaning. James watched this and felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. He watched it again. Rachel was standing near the door watching him watch it. She had known when she brought the laptop that this would mean something. She did not know exactly what. She waited. He watched it a 3rd time, and then he closed the laptop and sat back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He asked Rachel if she knew anything about Rosa. Rachel said she knew the basics from the household staff file. James said, "What does she do when she is not here?" Rachel said she did not know. James said, "Find out." Quietly, Rachel nodded and left. What Rachel found over the next 2 days was not what either of them expected. Rosa had worked in the Calloway house for 2 years without incident or complaint. She had previously worked for a family in the same neighborhood who had given her an exceptional reference. She had 3 children. She had a son with a medical condition requiring ongoing treatment. She was saving for the 3rd surgery that her youngest child needed. The surgery was expensive and Rosa's insurance covered part of it, but not enough, and she had been quietly putting aside money for 14 months. She needed approximately $6,000 more, and at her current rate of saving, she would have it in 8 months. The surgery was recommended before the child turned 10. The child was 7. She had time, but barely. Rachel presented all of this to James on a Thursday morning in the same quiet way she delivered all information to him, factual and without editorializing. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. He asked if the surgery was something that needed to happen sooner rather than later for the child's quality of life. Rachel said the doctor had recommended it by age 9 at the latest for the best outcome. James did the math quietly. The child was 7. 8 more months of saving put the surgery at the edge of the recommended window. He nodded once and said thank you, and Rachel understood that the conversation was over and left. On Friday afternoon, Rosa arrived at the Calloway house the same as she always did. She let herself in with her key, hung her coat by the back door, and began her usual routine. She had no idea that James was home. He was almost never home on a Friday afternoon. But today he was sitting in the kitchen when she walked through to collect her cleaning supplies from the utility room. Rosa stopped in the doorway. She said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway," and began to step around him the way staff learn to move around the people they work for, efficiently and without taking up space. James said, "Rosa, do you have a moment?" She turned around and looked at him with the careful expression of a person who is trying to read whether they are in trouble. He said, "Please sit down." She sat at the kitchen table across from him and folded her hands and waited. James looked at her for a moment. He was not good at this. He had not had a genuine personal conversation in this kitchen with anyone since Eleanor. He said, "I owe you an apology first." Rosa looked confused. He said, "The security cameras in the living room have audio on a separate channel I was not aware of. I heard what you said to the photograph." This was not entirely true. The cameras had no audio. But James had thought about what her lips might have said for 2 days and had made a decision. Rosa looked at him and then looked at the table. Her hands tightened slightly. She said quietly, "I am sorry. I should not have done that. It was unprofessional." James said, "What did you say to her?" Rosa looked up. He said it gently, not as a demand, just as a question from a man who genuinely wanted to know. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told her the house was still beautiful, that she had chosen beautiful things." She paused. "And I told her that whoever she had loved in this house was still being taken care of, that things were still in order." She looked at her hands. "I know it is strange. I just felt like she might want to know." James sat across from her and said nothing for a long enough time that Rosa began to think she had said something wrong. Then James Calloway, who had not laughed in 4 years, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its immediate neighbor. It was the sound of something breaking open in a small way. He put his hand over his mouth and looked at the window, and his eyes were bright. He said, "She would have loved that. That is exactly the kind of thing she would have loved." His voice was not steady when he said it. Rosa watched him and did not look away and did not pretend she had not noticed. She said, "She sounds like she was wonderful." He said, "She was the best person I have ever known." They sat in that kitchen for 40 minutes. James talked about Eleanor in a way he had not talked about her to anyone since the funeral. Not the careful versions he gave to business colleagues who asked politely. The real version. The Eleanor who sang badly and enthusiastically to songs on the radio. The Eleanor who had once argued with a parking attendant for 25 minutes on principle and won. The Eleanor who used to leave small notes in his jacket pockets that he would find weeks later. Rosa listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested and not waiting for their turn to speak. She asked questions. Small ones. The kind that opened doors rather than closed them. James answered all of them. When the 40 minutes were over, James stopped himself mid-sentence and said, I have kept you from your work." Rosa said it was fine. He said it was not, that she was here to do a job, and he had held her up, and he wanted to make sure she was compensated for the time. Rosa said that was not necessary. He said it was, and then he said something else. He said, "I understand you have a son who needs surgery." Rosa went very still. She said quietly, "How do you know that?" He said that he had asked Rachel to look into her background after he saw the footage. He said he hoped that was not an intrusion. Rosa looked at him carefully. She said, "Are you going to let me go because of it? Because of the medical costs and the time I might need?" The question was asked plainly, without anger, but with the bluntness of someone who had learned that direct questions save time. James looked at her and said, "No, I am going to pay for the surgery." Rosa said nothing. He said, "All of it. Whatever the insurance does not cover and whatever you have not yet saved." Rosa said, "Mr. Calloway." He said, "I want to. Not as your employer. Just as a person who has been given something and wants to give something back." Rosa looked at him, and he could see her deciding whether this was real. She said, "You do not know me." He said, "I know that you talk to photographs of people who are gone and tell them things are all right. That is enough to know." Rosa looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were full, but she did not cry. She said, "His name is Tito." James said, "How old is he?" She said, 7. "He is very loud for someone who cannot fully hear yet." She said it with the particular combination of exhaustion and complete adoration that only belongs to parents. James smiled. "A real one." Rosa noticed it and said, "You should do that more." He said, "Do what?" She said, "Smile. It changes your whole face." He said, "My wife used to say that." Rosa said, "She was right." They sat for another moment, and then Rosa stood up and said she should get to work because the upstairs guest rooms were not going to clean themselves. James said that was fair. She picked up her supplies from the utility room, and James stayed at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked out at the garden where Phil was moving slowly between the roses. The surgery was scheduled 6 weeks later. James arranged everything through Rachel, who handled the logistics with the hospital and Rosa's insurance provider. On the morning of the surgery, James arrived at the hospital waiting room and sat down next to Rosa, who looked at him with an expression that asked without words what he was doing there. He said he had a light morning and nowhere to be. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded and looked back at the doors. They sat side by side in the waiting room for 3 hours. James bought bad coffee from the vending machine twice, and Rosa told him the second cup was worse than the first, and he agreed. Lucia, Rosa's 15-year-old daughter, sat on Rosa's other side and drew in her sketchbook the entire time, and at one point silently turned the sketchbook and showed James what she had drawn. It was the waiting room, the chairs, the vending machine, the two of them sitting together. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "This is very good." Lucia said, "I know." Rosa said, "Lucia." Lucia said, "It is true, though." James laughed. Out loud. Fully. The sound filled the waiting room, and Rosa turned and looked at him, and then she laughed too, and Lucia looked at both of them and shook her head and went back to drawing. When the surgeon came out and said the procedure had gone well and Tito was in recovery and asking for his mother, Rosa stood up so quickly her chair scraped back loudly on the floor. She put her hand on James's arm for just a second before she moved toward the doors. It was brief and instinctive, and she probably did not even notice she had done it. James noticed. He stood in the waiting room as the doors swung shut behind her, and he stood there for a moment in the particular stillness of a large room after something important has just happened inside it. He left the hospital and drove home and walked through the front door and stood in the hallway of the quiet 14-room house. It was still quiet. That had not changed. But something about the quiet felt different today. Less like absence, more like pause. He walked through to the living room and looked at the photograph on the antique side table. Eleanor at the lake, laughing at something he could no longer remember, completely herself. He stood there for a moment, and then he did something he had not done in 4 years. He said something to the photograph. He said, "You would have liked her." He stood there in the quiet, and then he straightened the frame slightly the way Eleanor always used to straighten things that were already straight, and he went to his study and opened his laptop, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he did not start with his emails. He sat for a moment and thought about bad coffee, and a girl who said "I know" without apology, and a woman who told photographs that things were still in order, and he thought about how entirely unexpected it was the places and people and small, unplanned moments through which a person found their way back to themselves. Then he smiled again, quietly, to no one in particular, and it felt, as Eleanor would have said, like exactly the right thing to do.